If the first Death Stranding was about rebuilding the bonds that connect human civilization, then Death Stranding 2 on the beach is about rebuilding broken bonds between individual people. Neil Vana, the mysterious enemy porter who appears in the Tar Anomaly segments, lies at the heart of this deeply personal narrative. A character who looks so much like the protagonist of Metal Gear Solid that fans have taken to calling him Stranded Snake, Neil fills a similar role to Cliff Unger from Death Stranding 1, and the memories he carries with him are just as revelatory. Through Neil, Sam learns the truth about Lou's origins, comes to terms with the loss and betrayal of his former partner, Lucy, and discovers that sometimes it takes a former rival to restore a shattered strand. Neil's initial appearance comes in Chapter 5, in the game's first Tar Anomaly segment. Much like with Cliff's missions in the original game, the characters go out of their way to tell Sam to prepare himself and gear up, because once he enters the Tar Anomaly, he's not coming back until the job is done. Letting the player know that shit's about to get real like this is one of my favorite video game tropes, and I love that Kojima is still using it here in 2025. Fortunately, the mission ahead will have plenty of firearms to pick up if you need them, but if you're someone who likes to be prepared, it's definitely not a bad idea to stock up on some guns, or sticks as they're so often called in the world of Death Stranding. Upon entering the Tar Anomaly, Sam finds himself in what appears to be a city in Mexico on the Day of the Dead. It might even be Mexico City itself, but I'm not certain about that. Right away, we can tell that something is wrong with the city. Beneath the celebrations and fireworks, it's burning. Amidst this chaos, Neil makes one hell of an entrance, speeding through the streets on a motorcycle with an escort of skeletal soldiers. At first, his face is covered by a hood, though as we'll later learn, it's actually a very important scarf. It's a memorable introduction that sets up Neil to look like a villain, and the source of the fire and the flames overwhelming the city. It's smart to position Neil like this, especially at this point in the game. Returning Death Stranding players would likely assume that Neil was in line for a more nuanced role given their prior experience with Cliff, but to a new player, and Death Stranding 2 certainly made a concerted effort to appeal to new players, Neil comes off like a full-on antagonist. Back with Sam, while he's exploring the burning cityscape, he'll catch sight of a young girl whose hair is coated in tar. Notably, she's the only person the player has seen in this segment thus far, aside from Neil himself, who appears to be human. Everyone else is either a skeletal soldier or a ghost. But before Sam can investigate further, Neil's forces are after him. They advance from the graveyard, in a scene that will take on some serious significance later on. Once Sam's fought his way to the graveyard, he'll engage Neil in a boss battle. It's an exciting segment, as the two porters, who have quite a bit more in common than just their occupation, fire at each other from behind the tombstones and crypts. Cinematic, scenic, and incredibly fun, just like you'd expect from Kojima. When Neil is defeated, his appearance shifts as he ditches his military fatigues for street clothes. With his dying breaths, he attempts to tell Sam his full name, Neil Vana, but all he can manage to say is Nirvana, which Dollman suspects to be his attempt at saying Nirvana, and thus an indication that they've reached the realm of the enlightened dead. But before he can say any more, he dies, and an explosion blasts Sam away from whatever would have remained of his body. It goes a bit unnoticed in all of this, especially given what our protagonist is about to find, but the fact that there's clearly still fighting going on despite the defeat of Neil and the skeletal soldiers tells the player that there's more to the story of whatever tragedy befell this Mexican city. This place isn't on fire as a result of anything this mysterious porter and his comrades did. Something else happened here, but we'll find out more about that at the end of the game. Critically, after being knocked away from the explosion, Sam finds the same tar-haired girl from earlier trapped under debris. He tries to save her, but before he can do so, an artillery shell lands in front of him, knocking him away from her the same way he was just knocked away from Neil. When he looks up, he'll see that the tar-haired girl has somehow survived the blast, and is now wrapped in a cocoon-like structure. Once Sam's returned to the real world, he'll find that the tar is gone, but that the cocoon has been left behind. Back on the Magellan, the crew will open up the cocoon and find the tar-haired girl, who they'll later name Tomorrow, inside. Tomorrow has her own story to tell, and she'll be getting her own video towards the end of the series. But to examine Neil's role in Death Stranding 2 properly, we will need to discuss her here and there. She is, after all, the most important character in the game aside from Sam. A decent bit of time passes before we encounter Neil again, but in the interim, there are some discussions amongst the group about the realm Sam visited in the Tar Anomaly segment being some kind of nirvana, or at the very least, an afterlife, which will help to set up some big reveals later on. After completing Mission 30, one of your longest missions to date, another Tar Anomaly will appear. This time around, when Sam goes out to it, a tar figure of Neil will pull him into the strange realm. Inside, Sam will find himself beneath the ocean. He'll navigate this underwater region until he reaches a hospital, where Neil, once again, will arrive in style, on a boat with more skeletal soldiers. Much like with the burning city in Mexico, we will get some context on the scenery down the line, but it's easy to miss, and the player will need to piece a few things together to figure it out. Sam will have to fight through a few waves of soldiers to reach Neil, but once he does, he'll find him sitting atop a building in the area beyond the waterlogged hospital. Another boss fight will then begin, and though it's not nearly the cinematic spectacle the last one was, there are some interesting features to it, like these underwater icicles that will slow the player if Sam gets near them. So be sure to take them out, and then turn your attention back to our mysterious porter. Once Sam's beaten Neil for a second time, he'll again say something important with his dying breaths. As he drops to the sea floor, he'll say Lou, ask where Lou is, and then drop a case he'd been carrying with him. Sam will look over his body and find a Bridges ID card. He'll then take a look at the case, which begins to cry like a baby as he approaches it. Neil comes alive again for the briefest of moments, trying to keep Sam away from the case. But after a quick struggle, he dies again. Now free to open the case, Sam finds a disturbing baby doll inside. If you think back to the first game, Cliff had these too, and they always seemed to symbolize his desire to find his BB, who we thought was Lou, but as it turned out, he was after Sam all along. When you combine this with what Neil said about Lou before he died, it should be clear at this point that there's some kind of connection between Neil, Lou, BBs, and likely tomorrow. The baby doll then explodes, blasting Sam away from Neil's body just like after the previous boss battle. Sam is then returned to the real world, with Neil's ID card to show for his efforts. Importantly, before he returns to the Magellan, the crew reveals that although Sam was battling Neil inside the strange realm for what seemed like a while, he was gone for only a few seconds in the real world. This prompts Dollman to speculate that time must flow differently in the realm, and that it's similar to how things function over on the beach. Back on the Magellan, the crew uses Neil's ID card to find out more about him, and uncovers some fascinating information. First off, he wasn't saying Nirvana when Sam defeated him back in their first encounter. He was trying to say Neil Vana, his full name. As it turns out, Neil was a porter who worked under the table for Bridges as a smuggler. Official records say he brought over resources and medical supplies, but Charlie dispenses with the bullshit and reveals that he was really bringing drugs and other illegal paraphernalia across the Mexican border. Charlie goes on to explain that Neil's Bridges ID card led him into a few select facilities, specifically those related to the BB experiments. Tying this together with the way Cliff functioned in Death Stranding 1, Neil's question about Lou, and the baby doll from the Tar Anomaly segment, and it's clear that Neil not only has a connection to Lou's past, but that whatever he was smuggling from Mexico is likely related to the origins of all of the BBs. At this point in the game, Sam has been trying to figure out all he can about the early days of the BB experiments in pursuit of Lou's origins. So far, he's uncovered that Lou's serial number wasn't actually BB-28. Her original serial number was BB-00, indicating that she was one of the first BBs ever created when Bridges embarked on their project to create the chiral network. Initially, the plan was to use her to bring the whole network into being, but that plan was abandoned in favor of one that used a group of sacrificial BBs instead, and thus BB-00, Lou, was moved into storage, and given the serial number of BB-28 later on. All of this is to say that we can reasonably conclude at this point that Neil must have some involvement in all of this. This link deepens when we consider what Charlie says next. As it turns out, one of the Bridges buildings that Neil had access to is the same place where Sam went for therapy with his romantic partner, Lucy. There's definitely something not great about Sam getting therapy from a woman he was in a relationship with, but that's a discussion for another time. Regardless, the Bridges building where Lucy practiced therapy is one of the most important locations in the lore of Death Stranding. This building is where Sam's world fell apart. There was a void out there that killed everyone in the surrounding area, including Lucy, who was pregnant at the time. Sam was told that the child wasn't his. We'll get into that more in a few minutes here, but as far as we can tell, at the time she died, her and Sam were working on repairing their relationship, and thus her death broke him. Sam survived the void out thanks to his ability to repatriate, and ended up changing his name and leaving Bridges to work as a freelance porter for 10 years due to his overwhelming guilt and grief. And according to Charlie, Neil was among those who died in this void out as well. Thus, Neil is closely linked with several of the game's key plotlines, including Lou's backstory, Sam's backstory, and this all-important void out. This, in turn, helps to establish Neil as a bit of a mirror for Sam. He's a fellow porter, he frequented the same Bridges building, and he played some part in Lou's past that isn't fully clear just yet. It also helps to differentiate him from Cliff, who, up until the very end of the first game, was never really a mirror for Sam. He initially appeared to be a dangerous military leader, whereas Neil has quite a bit in common with our protagonist right from the beginning. At the end of this segment, the crew asks Sam if he ever noticed Neil during his visits to the building, and he replies that he didn't. It's a small part of the conversation, but given Death Stranding's themes of human bonds and relationships, I think there's some commentary here about how we all probably have more connections with the strangers who pass by us on a daily basis than we might realize, and how when you finally do start interacting with someone, you might discover that you've been running in similar circles for quite a while. I really like this point because it reminds me of the story of how I met my wife. We matched on Tinder, but on our first date, we found out that we had many of the same friends, and nearly met at a 4th of July party a few years earlier. I think that's part of what Kojima's trying to get at here by establishing so many links between Sam and Neil. That they have so much in common that in another life, they could have been friends, and probably walked by each other many times entirely unaware of how much they're alike. From there, these connections between Neil and Sam slowly take a dramatic turn. After the second Tar Anomaly segment, Sam starts to see more and more visions of Neil every time he plugs into the BB pod. He's been seeing them here and there all along, but they increase noticeably at this point. He starts to see Neil with Lucy, and hear bits of conversations between the two of them, including some that mention Lou and seem to indicate that she's Neil's child. It's been delivered to us in bits and pieces since Death Stranding 1, but at the time Lucy died, her relationship with Sam was in a difficult place. She cheated on him, but we didn't know who her affair partner was, and it's not clear Sam did either. It seems like she might not have relayed that information to him before she died. But these visions make it obvious that it was Neil. So at the same time that the game is drawing attention to all of these similarities between Sam and Neil, it's building him up as something of a formative villain from his past, a contributing factor to the distant and detached person he was at the beginning of the first game. To cheat on a partner is always a betrayal, but for Sam, Lucy's betrayal cut especially deep. He was visiting her practice to work on his phobia, his fear of being touched, and he's a demisexual, meaning that he needs to establish an emotional connection with a potential partner before he can have a sexual attraction to them. So in order for Sam to have been intimate with Lucy, and we know that he was, because the end of the game makes that abundantly clear, Sam needed to overcome a debilitating phobia and open himself up to Lucy in a way he might not have ever opened himself up to anyone. This was a profound betrayal, one that unwound the progress Sam had made and caused him to become especially distrusting of others, even by the standards of someone in a world as frayed as the one portrayed in Death Stranding. And when you throw Lou into this mess, it really becomes an existential nightmare. Sam's built a real bond with the crew of the Magellan, and by Death Stranding 2, he's made a stunning amount of progress in reconnecting with others. But it was Lou that helped him do that, and now it seems like she was, all along, the love child of Lucy and Neil, the living, breathing product of their affair. Imagine how Sam must feel in this moment, how it has to crush him to think that the BB that made him feel human again was born from the betrayal that caused him to withdraw from others in the first place. Higgs even taunts Sam about this when he tortures him at the beginning of the third act, feeding into this belief. All of this is to say that at this point in the game, even if the player might be suspecting some misdirection on Kojima's part, or theorizing about how Neil's role might evolve in what's left of the narrative, what they're supposed to think, and what Sam is supposed to think, is that Neil is a complete asshole who played a role in the most destructive incident of his life. This slow-burning tension between Sam and Neil reaches its climax in the third Tar Anomaly segment. Here, Sam faces off with Neil in what seems to be a Mexican subway station. For a third time now, our antagonist arrives in epic fashion. Here, he rolls in a car that drives upside down on the ceiling, hinting at some of the anti-gravity elements that will make up the boss fight to follow. After an exciting battle, Sam defeats Neil's skeletal soldiers, forcing Neil to retreat to his subway car. There, he pulls out a cigarette, really hammering home the whole stranded snake thing. As he looks out the window, he has a flashback that Sam shares. In the flashback, we see young Neil. I'm guessing he's about 7 or 8 here, in the same burning Mexican city from the first Tar Anomaly segment. As mentioned earlier, back when we were talking about that segment, it was never Neil or his skeletal soldiers causing the damage. It was something else, and here we see that it seems as though this city was attacked by giant BTs. Digging deep into the lore, we know from the first game that the Death Stranding essentially started when Amelie brought Sam, who in those days was known to everyone as the original Bridge Baby, back from the beach, and entrusted him to the care of her Ha, Bridget Strand. This event did result in BT invasions and voidouts worldwide, So it's possible that what we're seeing here is the aftermath of Bridget/Amelie's decision to do this. That said, it would also mean that Neil, and another important character who we're about to meet, are both nearly 10 years older than Sam, and I have a hard time believing that. But we can look into this potential timeline discrepancy later. Regardless, when we pick up with young Neil, he's become separated from his parents, and as he's looking for them, there's an explosion behind him. Though he survives it without any serious damage, the pendant he wears around his neck drops on the back of his hand, where it becomes superheated from the nearby flames, thus branding the symbol into his skin. He calls out for help, at which point a little girl comes to his aid. She takes off her scarf, the same scarf that Neil has been tying around his head, and ties it around his wounded leg, and together they try to find their way out of the burning city. But before they can get very far, an artillery shell lands in front of them, knocking them both out. When Neil comes to, the little girl is buried beneath a pile of rubble. Neil tries to free her, and in the process, the still superheated brand from his hand gets burned into hers as well. Before he can pull her out, Neil's parents call out to him, and rather than continue to help his new friend, he leaves to reunite with them. It's hard to blame a kid who's not even 10 for, well, most things, and I can't fault Neil for wanting to find his parents before he potentially loses them again. But this is a pretty shitty thing to do to a person who was there for him in his time of need. I bring this up not to condemn the behavior of an 8-year-old, but rather to highlight how Neil surely felt about this moment in the years that followed. Unless he's completely heartless, and despite his role in Lucy's infidelity, we have no reason to suspect that he was, we can safely conclude that this is a moment he'll come to regret. A memory he'll look back on when he's older, and wish he could go back and change what he did. Once the flashback is over, Neil looks down at the symbol, still visible on the back of his hand, and a strange coffin-shaped object that will become very important very soon. Desperate to understand why this memory from Neil's childhood is so essential to his story, Sam pursues his enemy and duels him one-on-one in both the subway car and the station's top floor. It's easily the best stretch of any of Neil's levels. No matter the genre, no matter the format, no matter the style, no one does single combat between a protagonist and an antagonist in a video game like Hideo Kojima. Once Neil is defeated, he'll say Sam's name, much like he said Lou's at the end of the previous encounter, and ask our protagonist if that's indeed who he is. Before Sam can confirm his identity, a piece of wreckage from the ceiling falls down, trapping Neil beneath it in exactly the same manner as the little girl from his flashback. He calls out to Sam again, and of course, our noble porter comes to his aid without hesitation. It's a full circle moment for Neil. When he was a boy, he chose not to rescue a little girl who'd been nothing but a friend to him, someone he had every reason to help. Here, Sam chooses to save a man who's been nothing but a rival to him, someone he has every reason to hate. As Death Stranding 2 shows us time and time again, sometimes you can make an ally out of even the most unlikely of people. In the aftermath of this incredible moment for both men, Neil, now in plain clothes instead of his military fatigues, confesses to Sam that he's sorry, and says that he tried to protect them. Who he's talking about isn't clear just yet, and then hands Sam the scarf the little girl wrapped around his injured leg back in the memory. Wrapped up in it, he'll find both Neil's pendant and the strange coffin-shaped object. Sam asks Neil what it is, but all Neil says is to keep Lou safe. Determined to learn more, Sam places his hand on Neil's shoulder, and a series of flashbacks begins. The flashbacks start with Neil, now an adult, visiting Lucy at a Bridges facility. We've seen bits and pieces of Lucy now and then when Sam plugged into BB's pod, but it's here that we actually see her for an extended scene. After attempting to have a quick smoke, another stranded snake moment, Neil and Lucy have a brief introduction. He reveals that he's a porter, but you can tell from his expression that there's more to the story than that. The camera then cuts away, as their therapy session begins. When it's over, Neil goes to leave, at which point Lucy asks him if he remembers her. Neil has no idea what she's talking about, so she shows him the brand mark on both of their hands, confirming that she's the girl from his memory, the girl who came to his aid back in Mexico, who he abandoned beneath the rubble in favor of reuniting with his parents. Neil, of course, is shocked by this surprise reunion, but Lucy gives him little time to linger on that, as she slaps him across the face and then begins to pummel him on the shoulder. As we discussed earlier, even though he was a kid at the time, she has every right to be mad at him. But yikes. Between sleeping with her patients and trying to beat them up, Lucy might just be the most unprofessional therapist in all of video games. But back to the scene, Neil tries to calm her down and ends up embracing her, at which point it's clear that an entirely different kind of tension is about to rise between these two reunited souls. Circling back to our earlier discussion about how Sam and Neil frequented the same Bridges facility, this is another example of the whole you might never know what you have in common with someone theme. On top of that, there's definitely an idea of fate at play here, that if two people are supposed to be connected, then the universe will find a way to link them together, no matter how long it might take. These two knew each other for all of a few minutes decades ago, and here they are again, working for the same company. In the next flashback, Neil gets into an argument with the Bridges executive. The Bridges executive calls out Neil for his status as an illegal immigrant, and in response, Neil reminds the executive that he's only been doing what Bridges has asked him to do. The Bridges executive then says that they've overlooked his illegal status because of the work he's done for the company, and explains that if he doesn't do the next job they have in line for him, we're not told what job that is at this point, then there will be repercussions. Neil counters by shouting in the executive's face, and then marches out of the room. Later, Neil opens up to Lucy about his stress, and confesses to her that he needs to leave Bridges, because what they've been forcing him to do is deeply unethical. He then reveals the specific cargo the company has tasked him with carrying: brain-dead pregnant women, the raw material needed to create BBs. As I said earlier when we got what was essentially Neil's dossier, there were plenty of clues that Neil was involved in the earliest BB experiments, but this spells it out for us. If I were to describe Kojima's mystery style, that would be it, honestly. He lays out a lot of vague clues that might be just enough to figure out where he's going, but if you're ever unsure, don't worry. He's going to hit you over the head with it eventually. After admitting what he's been doing, Neil begins to hyperventilate, and Lucy calms him down by touching his face and helping him to control his breathing. It's here that their relationship seems to take a turn. I'd wager that they were flirting and that the romantic tension was building during their sessions, but I'll bet that this is the one where things went over the edge into a full-on affair. So while this is, on one hand, a moment of betrayal, it's also one of humanity for Neil. Despite what we've seen from him in the Tar Anomaly segments, and even if he was deeply involved in the betrayal that broke our protagonist, he clearly has a deeply human heart. He was forced to work for Bridges out of desperation, and now they've got him doing something terrible that he wants no part of. But he's stuck, with nowhere to go. He either needs to keep working for Bridges or deal with the repercussions. It's hard not to feel for him in this moment, despite what he did to Sam. In the third flashback segment, Neil and Lucy's relationship indeed seems to have blossomed. They're now spending time together at night, after work in her office. She tries on a scarf he got for her, a replacement for the one she tied around his wounded leg back in Mexico, and then they take a selfie together to see if they can figure out who's watching them from a car down the road. At first, I wondered if the car down the road was a private investigator Sam had hired to tail Lucy, but I'm pretty sure it's just Bridges, because as we're about to find out, Lucy is carrying something that's very important to the company. In the last of these flashbacks, Lucy tells Neil that she's pregnant, and that the baby isn't his, but Sam's. He asks if she's sure about this, prompting Lucy to pass a data tablet over to him. Lucy then says their affair was a mistake, a statement that upsets Neil, that he vehemently disagrees with. Neil stands up and hands her something, we don't see what at first, and tells her that he loves her, and that it doesn't matter to him if she's pregnant with another man's child. But Lucy is unmoved. She loves Sam, and thus their affair needs to end. Heartbroken, Neil leaves the room. Before the flashback ends, the camera pans down to Lucy's hands, revealing that Neil gave her the two items that bound them together way back in Mexico: the scarf she wrapped around his leg and the pendant that branded them both. They're symbols of Neil's love for Lucy, of his willingness to be with her despite it all. Symbols that Lucy will later return when she's in need of help. But on Neil's end, this scene again demonstrates his humanity. He might be in an affair, but he's genuinely committed to Lucy, to the point where it doesn't matter to him whose child she's carrying. He just wants to be with her. Moreover, since this is the first time, chronologically anyway, that we've seen the scarf since that night in Mexico, we now have proof that it isn't just an item he somehow came across in the mysterious Tar realm. He kept it with him for years, and thus, it's a sign of his lifelong regret and his desire to atone for failing to save Lucy. And when we next see him, he'll have an opportunity to prove just how devoted to her he is. When Sam returns to the real world, he's got the small coffin-shaped object with him. Fragile takes a look at it, and once Sam's gotten some rest in his room, she brings him some startling information. The small coffin-shaped object, she explains, is a memory drive containing data that proves what Lucy said in Neil's flashback. Lou was indeed Sam's child. This puts Neil's actions throughout the game in an entirely different context. Just like Cliff before him, he was never an enemy to Sam. He was just trying to deliver a message Sam needed to hear. Despite what he may have thought, despite Lucy's infidelity, he was Lou's father, either through a sense of altruism or duty. I suspect it's more the latter than the former. Neil wanted Sam to know this. For the time being, the impact of this revelation on Sam is lessened. Right now, as far as he knows, Lou is dead. So though he can take some small comfort in knowing the truth of her origins, it still can't bring her back to life. But of course, there are more Neil-related reveals to come. Several hours pass before we see Neil again. He doesn't show up for his final appearance until the closing minutes of Death Stranding 2. When he does, it's during the crew's attempt to jump the Magellan back to the real world. At this point, Higgs has been defeated, but along the way, they lost Fragile, who, in truth, has been dead since the beginning of the game. But they did rescue Tomorrow, and they stopped her from becoming the next extinction entity. Still unconscious during the jump, Tomorrow makes contact with Neil's spirit in the realm of the dead, and a series of climactic flashbacks begins. In the first flashback, Neil, slightly irritated, arrives at Lucy's office late at night. She's visibly pregnant here, which implies that several months have passed since their last meeting. Lucy explains that she's learned that Bridges is after Lou. They intend to use her as a sacrificial BB. She's not about to let that happen, and thus she's devised a plan to try and protect Lou. The first part of this plan, she says, is telling everyone that Neil is Lou's father, not Sam. It's not exactly the best idea. If Lucy had data confirming that Sam was the father, then it's reasonable to conclude that an all-powerful corporation like Bridges could have gotten their hands on the same information. But hey, desperate times call for desperate measures, and this situation sure is desperate. Initially, Neil refuses, but Lucy pleads with him, begging him to keep Lou safe. The same thing he said to Sam at the end of the third Tar Anomaly segment. And after looking down at the burn mark on both their hands, he agrees. This is a huge moment for Neil. All those years ago in Mexico, he failed to keep Lucy safe. Now he has the opportunity to redeem himself by saving her child and protecting the woman he loves, while also sticking it to the company that's been using him at the same time. He can't be with Lucy, but he can at least demonstrate his affection for her by finding a way to save her and her unborn child. To that end, Neil makes plans to smuggle Lucy across the border to Mexico the following week. This means that he plans to do for her the opposite of what he's been doing for Bridges all along. They've been having him bring brain-dead women 7 months into their pregnancy from Mexico over the border and into the United States. Now, he's planning on bringing a fully alive woman who's 7 months into her pregnancy from the United States over the border into Mexico. Once again, it's more full circle type stuff for Neil here. He regrets what he's been doing for Bridges, and I'd wager he feels as though this task can help make that right. Before Neil leaves, Lucy returns his pendant, along with the coffin-shaped memory drive, explaining how these two objects ended up in his possession. She also tells him that it contains everything, relaying its importance and explaining how he knew he needed to give it to Neil at the end of their last encounter. Though he never met Sam, he really does seem to have a sense of duty about delivering this essential information. At least that's how it comes off to me. He is a porter, after all. Delivering things of importance is exactly what they do. On the day of their planned escape, Neil arrives in a hurry, clearly concerned that Bridges might come after Lucy at any moment. I suspect he also knows, based on his previous conversation with the Bridges executive, that the company is pretty close to being done with him as well, meaning that their plot might be over before it ever really starts. He also brought flowers for Lucy, to make their ruse more romantic, more believable to any onlookers. After one last, sentimental look at the room that brought him and the little girl from Mexico back together again, Neil leaves with Lucy. As they head down the hall, their escape hits a bit of a snag. Lucy's Bridges ID card still works, but it seems that Neil's has been shut off. With a nifty switcheroo from Lucy, she manages to get past the two guards blocking their way. This is some clear foreshadowing that Bridges is indeed onto the couple. This is confirmed as Neil and Lucy make their way down the next hallway, where the Bridges executive confronts them. He says that he knows what they're up to, and that he's not about to let them escape with the child of her patriot. Neil angrily draws a handgun and insists the baby is his, but the Bridges executive isn't buying it. With Neil distracted, a pair of Bridges guards flank him and fire their rifles. They surely intended to hit Neil, but Lucy moves ever so slightly at the last second, and the bullets strike her instead. It's impossible to overstate just how stupid this was of these Bridges guards to get trigger happy here. Yes, they had a good angle on Neil, but given how important Lucy was to the company's plans, This was really foolish on their part. With Lucy wounded, Neil flees to a nearby conference room, where the Bridges executive is waiting for him. Neil begs him to save her, and he agrees to try, but only if Neil lets them take Lou. Neil asks the Bridges executive to give him his word, and though he does, it's clear from his expression and his tone of voice that he's just telling Neil what he wants to hear. But Neil, in the heat of the moment, and desperate to save Lucy, doesn't realize this. Predictably, the Bridges executive opens the door. The Bridges guards then enter and kill Neil. Shortly thereafter, Lucy dies as well. It's easy to fault Neil for falling for this or call him naive, but I prefer to think of it as another sign of his love for Lucy. With her bleeding out on the table behind him, he agreed to a Hail Mary deal to try and save her life. It was the only option he had. If he had shot the Bridges executive and gone full stranded snake in an attempt to escape the building, Lucy still would have died, and Lou along with her. Lucy seems to have had an opinion of her own about what Neil should have done in this moment, but we'll get to that in a future video on her. After Neil dies, we cut to a morgue, where some coroners are looking over Neil's body. While they're talking about the successful extraction of Lou, they notice that Neil's body is going into necrosis faster than it should. They run off to get the corpse disposal team, but it's no use. Neil's body explodes in a void-out that destroys the entire Bridges facility and the surrounding city. Sam is caught in this blast as well, along with Lucy's body. In my last Death Stranding video, I described this as the first big void-out. I was wrong about that, and I'd like to give a shout out to Vic Viper 1984 for bringing this to my attention. It wasn't the first big void-out. That happened much earlier in Manhattan during the first Bridge Baby experiments, but it is the void-out that sundered Sam's own personal world. This void-out caused him to leave Bridges, withdraw from society, dissolve the connections he once had, and it even triggered a relapse in his phobia, all things that wouldn't change until the end of the first game, when Lou helped restore its faith in humanity. This void-out was, basically, the inciting incident of Sam's personal narrative, and Neil was at the center of it. If these stupid Bridges guards hadn't shot Lucy, and the company hadn't tried to control her and unborn Lou, none of this would have happened. I've said before when it comes to Sam and Neil that I think there's an extended Kojima-style metaphor here about the protagonist of his current series fighting with a guy who looks so much like the protagonist of his previous series. And taking this a step further, I don't think it's a coincidence that it's a corrupt company like Bridges that fucks everything up, kills the woman they both loved, and robs the future of a baby they both, to some degree, tried to protect. But we can talk about that more another time. Regardless, all this makes Neil one of the most important characters in the wider lore of Death Stranding. A character whose actions intersect with several elements of the plot, and led to Sam's world falling apart in such dramatic fashion. And yet, as he entered the realm of the dead, it's clear that Neil wasn't satisfied with how his life ended. Lucy gave him a mission to protect Lou. Thus, when the void-out flashback is over, we cut to the realm of the dead, where Fragile ends up with Lou during her attempt to escape from Higgs. Determined to protect Sam's child, she turns Lou over to the souls of the realm of the dead, where she rapidly ages and becomes tomorrow. And as our protagonist arrives in the realm, by virtue of the tar anomalies, it's Neil who serves as her escort, guiding her back to the father who thought he'd never have a child. Decades ago, in this same burning Mexican city, he failed to save Tomorrow's mother. But by guiding her back to Sam, a man he had every reason to hate, he redeemed himself for what he did that night. Because reconnecting humanity, rebuilding the bonds that once linked us together, isn't just about making strands with people who are already close to us, our friends and our family. Reconnecting humanity sometimes requires building relationships with rivals, like two men who came together for the greater good of a woman they both loved, and the child she left behind. And that's what makes Neil so important to Death Stranding 2. Thanks for watching. Huge thanks to Dorian Piano, AmiRReza Piano, and Michael Matat for allowing me to use their piano covers for this video. To check out all three of these amazing artists, just follow the links down in the description box. Big shout out to all my silver and gold tier YouTube channel members and Patreon subscribers, including James Pruitt, Little Caesar, Reed, Bethonian, Anna Novikova, Sean Bobby, Green, and Draco Woloski, who get early access to these videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. See you guys next time, and go birds!